many religions claim to hold the key to man's salvation. Scientology is no exception.
The most fundamental explanation as regards Scientology's basic beliefs is that man is basically good, and that the individual is a spiritual being, that you've lived before and you'll live again, and that your capabilities are infinite, if not yet fully realized.
We have the ability to actually help make a difference in the situation in Haiti, and I just can't, see not using this plane to help.
But behind the church's high celebrity profile and pious exterior lies a leadership at war with its real and perceived enemies. They include a growing band of former Scientologists and any media like Four Corners that dares to report their grievances.
That was a private investigator who's been following us all night long.
In recent months, a storm has erupted around Scientology. In Australia and overseas, the church stands accused of breaking the law and destroying families. Its critics are growing in strength and numbers, openly challenging the church over how it treats its adherents and punishes them.
It's a slave camp, there's no question about it, because people are definitely abused.
People were thrown overboard, hands bound and feet bound and blindfolded. Women of 55 years old.
I was angry. Don't get me wrong, if I could have gone up there and king hit the very individual that signed my daughter to scrubbing out a dumpster, I would have been there.
Tonight on Four Corners, former members of the church who say they've suffered enough shine a light on the dark side of Scientology. In 1968, a British camera crew caught up with an eccentric middle-aged captain on his boat, the Royal Scotsman. The American was L. Ron Hubbard, and he'd made a name for himself as the founder of Scientology.
The subject name means skio, which means knowing how to know in the fullest sense of the word, ology, which is study of. So it is actually study of knowingness. That is what the word itself means.
When this interview was filmed, Hubbard was in trouble with authorities around the world. In the United States, the tax authorities were after him, and his followers stood accused of practicing mind control techniques.
Do you ever think that you might be quite mad?
Oh, yes. The one man in the world who never believes he's mad is a madman.
These are no ordinary seamen. Their allegiance and devotion to the mysterious man is total. To them, he is my Commodore.
Hubbard was on the run, moving from port to port, and had surrounded himself with a core of young and loyal Scientologists. He called them the Sea Organization, or Sea Org.
I was one of about 10 or 15 people who was invited, being the highest trained.
Hannah Eltringham Whitfield was an early member of Sea Org, and Hubbard rewarded her loyalty by appointing her captain of 2 ships. She remembers him as a complex, contradictory figure.
He appeared a quite distinguished, normal-looking, middle-aged person.
Did you and your fellow adherents in the church see him as some kind of savior?
Very definitely, yes.
But there was a dark side to L. Ron Hubbard. Behind the jovial smile lay a taste for extreme forms of discipline. How were people treated on those ships if they misbehaved or if they transgressed?
Abominably. I mean, looking back, I deeply regret even my fringe participation in some of the things that went on, and I'm ashamed of some of them. People were thrown overboard, hands bound and feet bound and blindfolded, women of 55 years old, for for running a process incorrectly, a counseling technique incorrectly in an auditing session, you know.
These people would be rescued, but Hubbard exercised absolute authority over his crews, and those who crossed him risked being consigned to a punishment group he called the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force.
They were dressed in rags, they were filthy, they weren't even allowed to bathe except maybe once a week, and their food would be served to them in slop buckets, and they would eat out of those slop buckets on the deck with their hands. And, you know, looking back at something like that, there's no way anyone can justify not saying something, not doing something, yet not one of us spoke out, not one of us did anything.
Hubbard's culture of unwavering obedience and extreme discipline survived his own passing in 1986 and continues to the present day, under the leadership of his successor, David Miscavige. In Australia, the movement Hubbard founded has had a stormy passage. After being banned in 3 states in the 1960s, Scientology achieved the legal status of a religion in 1983, allowing it to be tax-exempt. Now, there are calls for its status to be reviewed.
There definitely needs to be an inquiry into the church's status, because it's not really a church. It may have a philosophy that's religious, but it's strictly business.
Joe Reish is a former rugby league star who played for Eastern Suburbs and Canterbury Bankstown back in the 1970s. He was recruited to Scientology in Sydney at the age of 19. Later, he moved to America, and tonight he's speaking out for the first time.
Initially, I wasn't attracted to it, but I was curious about knowing how someone could be better. And I'm always about improvement. And if that was a way to improve me to be a better athlete or a better football player or a better person, I was interested.
As a well-known football player, Joe Reish was treated like a star by the church. And he wasn't just successful on the field, he was a fast learner of L. Ron Hubbard's teaching.
I did the highest level by the age of 23.
The painful experiences hidden in your reactive mind are the cause of your fears.
When members of the public are recruited into Scientology, they learn about Dianetics, L. Ron Hubbard's self-styled science of mental health.
What would life be like if all of the pain you've experienced no longer affected your abilities, emotions, and behavior? You would be yourself, free to enjoy life and reach your full potential. In short, your mind would be clear. That is the goal of Dianetics.
But learning Dianetics costs money. Joe Reish calls it the bait and switch.
What they don't tell you is that if you want to go clear, which is what Dianetics sells, that's a $35,000 to $75,000 project. You don't know that. So there's your first bait and switch. You buy a $3 book, and it's going to cost you 50 to 75 grand.
Some Scientologists pay even larger sums to move from Dianetics onto Scientology's more advanced spiritual pathway, the Bridge to Total Freedom. The bridge contains a series of levels designed to increase your spiritual powers.
Once you go clear, they say, well, forget about that. You need to go spiritually free. Well, hang on, I just got in to get rid of the mind. Now you tell me I got to go spiritually free? And there's another switch. But they don't tell you that's going to cost you as well. And there's this whole route all the way through the top. Oh, that'll run you 150 to 250 grand.
How much did you spend in all?
Well, prior to the marriage and with the marriage, I would say a total between my wife and I at the time, maybe $400,000 to $500,000.
I'll just stack these in here.
Okay, we need to shift our roll. Don't start stacking.
One Australian family who fell foul of the hard sell were the Andersons from Canberra. Now they've left the church, this is their third trip to the rubbish tip to offload their stock of Scientology materials.
Many thousands of dollars, eh?
I hope the tip's open today.
As public Scientologists trying to master the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, they found themselves deluged with phone calls asking them to buy more and more of his books.
We were receiving up to 250 phone calls a fortnight to buy books. If not to buy books, to donate books. If not to donate books, it's to buy a second set, you know?
It is an enormous commercial enterprise, isn't it?
No, it's a religion. It's a large international religion that you know, is exactly that, a religion.
But it makes an awful lot of money.
Well, the church is definitely the beneficiary of its parishioners and people who feel strongly about their religion and choose to give back to it and give to the planet as a result.
What many parishioners never discover, unless they pay to work their way up the bridge, is that L. Ron Hubbard, a prolific author of science fiction, wrote a secret scripture in 1967. In it, he describes how an evil intergalactic warlord called Xenu visited Earth millions of years ago, and the spirits or body thetans of people he killed are the cause of many of mankind's spiritual ills.
I was one of the first people who was introduced to and read the materials and was expected to start exorcising these body thetans, the body spirits, from my body. I couldn't believe the material, yet I knew I had to for my own survival and for my own eternal salvation.
By 1985, Scientology's elite unit, the Sea Org, was back on dry land, and Joe Reish joined up in Florida to work for the church full-time. There, he married a fellow Scientologist.
How much were you paid?
At the time, I was paid $20 a week.
Bit of a come down from your football days.
Exactly. I mean, the hourly rate was into the maybe 12 to 15 cents an hour, but you know, at that time we didn't consider it because we were getting fed. We had some birthing, despite the fact that it wasn't the greatest. We felt that we were at least contributing to something.
Everyone who joins the Sea Org signs a contract for 1 billion years, making a commitment to return and serve the church for endless lifetimes to come. Joe Reish was the go-to man when wealthy donors who were disillusioned with Scientology wanted their money back.
I was their #1 boy in Florida for doing all of these, let's call it resolutions and solving those problems.
In 1986, Joe Reish and his wife took steps to leave the Sea Org. Later, they divorced, but they and their children remained Scientologists. For 19 years, Joe Reish had jobs outside the church, often as a personal fitness trainer. Privately, he started questioning the church.
I had mentioned various things that I had some disagreements with, you know, to someone, like, why is it so expensive? And then that person would write a report about that and send it in.
Joe Reish knew he had a fight on his hands. In 2005, he was summoned to an internal inquiry called a Committee of Evidence, where the secret internal reports on him were disclosed. He was accused of entering into bad investment deals and breaking the rules of the church. But he says he wasn't allowed to see the reports, call witnesses, or have any kind of legal representation. Months later, the committee handed down its final report, shown here for the first time.
I went through the 7 or 8 page report that just basically listed out all of my crimes. Where they accused me of things that I said I wasn't guilty, they said, you're guilty, and here's the evidence. But the evidence was from those reports that were hearsay.
Joe Reish was declared a suppressive person and expelled from the church. But when he picked up the phone to call his children, he couldn't get through.
No response. I called again, no response. And then I realized, oh my God, here's what they did. They already had me declared a suppressive person. They told everyone else, including my children. I cried. That's sad, you know, it's my kids. But you don't do that to a parent. You don't do that. It's,
Did you talk to your kids after that? A spokesperson for the children told Four Corners that claiming that the Church of Scientology is the reason for a disconnection from his children does not tell the entire story. Joe decided long before 2005 by his own actions to separate himself from his family, an assertion that Joe Reish denies. Why was Joe Reish declared a suppressive person?
I have no idea. I have no idea. It's news to me. I actually know Joe Reish. I remember meeting him many years ago. He was somebody that I knew personally when I first started working with the church. In fact, I had no idea he'd even been expelled from the church.
But once you expel someone from the church, you tell that person's family inside the church to have nothing to do with them.
No, that is not the case. What specifically what you're referring to is if somebody is expelled from the church, anybody who insists on continuing to be connected to somebody who's been expelled from the church would be told that as long as they maintain that connection, they're not welcome in the church, because a church, any organization, and particularly a church, like other churches, has a right to not welcome in its ranks people who are supporting or connected to people who are attacking the church and mean the church harm.
Well, that's the last time I saw it, actually.
In Australia, other families have experienced the intense pain of disconnection from their children in the church. Liz Anderson hasn't seen her eldest child Fiona since 2005, when she was posted overseas from Sydney to work in the Sea Org in Clearwater, Florida. Now all she has left are these few mementos of Fiona's childhood.
The Tigers Netball Club.
Look, she's a beautiful girl. I mean, I just, and she's mine. I don't know. They can't take the parent away. They'll try.
How painful is it for all of you that Fiona is still in the church?
Well, I love my wife dearly, and there's been many times I've seen her just so distraught at the fact that she can't have contact with her daughter.
It's a very cruel doctrine, a very cruel policy to separate family members from each other on pain of being expelled from the church.
Well, let me put it this way. Considering just in the last couple of days and on my last trip to Clearwater, I saw Miss Peachy walking down the street. I believe, come to think of it, the street that she was walking down, I saw 2 or 3 payphones that she most capably could have stopped, picked up the phone, and called whomever she wished to speak with. So if she wanted to speak to her mother, I am sure she's perfectly capable of doing so.
Fiona Peachy, who is now 25 years old, has told Four Corners that while she loves her mother, she can't have any contact with her while her mother insults her religion.
You want a cup of tea?
The Anderson family's involvement with Scientology goes back 27 years.
How's your day?
Liz and James were both married before, and they spent their early adult lives in the Sea Org. When they became a couple, they fled the Sea Org and were expelled from the church.
That is, as a Scientologist, quite degrading. You know, your children are told you're a suppressive person.
It's busy in this kitchen today. A lot of production happening.
For years after being expelled, the Andersons worked to get back into favour with the church. Eventually, they were allowed back in as public Scientologists. And when Fiona was 14 years old, the Sea Org came asking for her.
You're indoctrinated as a parent that the best thing for your child, to save them, is to pull them out of the school system because they're corrupt and put them either in the Sea Org which would be ideal, or working in an org, a lower organisation.
Scared of the consequences if she refused, her mother took Fiona to Sydney.
She's got the biggest brown eyes, Fiona, and they just melt your heart. And she looked at me and she'd signed the billion-year contract. She said, "But can I just come home, Mum?" And I said to her, "Don't ever ring me and say you want to come home, because I can't do that for you, because you'll be declared a suppressive person if I take you." I violate so many rules as a parent. I signed over guardianship of our girl.
Fiona was recruited into the Sea Org at the youngest legal age for a child to leave school and start work.
And I stepped away. That's what you do. When you're indoctrinated and you've been declared a suppressive person and you're continually making up amends. So part of my amends is that I raised a beautiful daughter and I gave her to the church. Right or wrong, I take responsibility for my actions.
In 2005, Liz and James allowed their youngest child, Jordan, to follow in Fiona's footsteps.
I wanted to join the Sea Org ever since I was 2 years old. I remember walking around saying I'm going to be a counsellor in the Sea Org. I love the uniform and I wanted to have that honour as a Sea Org member. So I signed a contract for 1 billion years.
Why do you recruit children into the Sea Org?
Actually, we don't.
Well, there are parents out there who would say you do. The Andersons, for example, would certainly say that you've done that.
Okay. Well, in their individual case, fine. The fact of the matter is that the church doesn't discriminate against people by virtue of age.
When she arrived at the Sea Org, age 14, Jordan was asked to give a detailed account of her private life, something she herself would later demand of other recruits.
You've had no sexual relations, you haven't masturbated, you never watched a porn movie. You know, like, they really pull it to shreds and pieces, and like they even say you haven't had sex with an animal.
Jordan Anderson was posted to the HCO, the Hubbard Communications Office in Sydney, where she worked as a personnel control officer. She says she had an average of 3 days off a year. The job carried great responsibilities, the pay was minimal, and the hours excessive.
I stayed up 72 hours once, just trying to get someone approved to go auditor training overseas.
72 hours without sleep?
Mm.
And you were 15 at the time?
Well, if that is actually the case, that would be utterly and completely unacceptable.
The Sea Org provided Jordan with free board and lodging here in Sydney. But her work involved long hours, and once, she says, when she failed to recruit a member of the public, she was severely punished. She was told to scrub out a dumpster.
We didn't have any gloves, we had no masks. I was in my uniform pants and an old t-shirt. But there was no OH&S. I mean, they were violating every single point that I know of OH&S. And I was there until 2 o'clock in the morning. It was just putrid. I couldn't believe it. I would never do that to somebody.
When Liz Anderson heard what had happened to her daughter, she was incensed.
I was angry. Don't get me wrong, if I could have gone up there and king hit the very individual that signed my daughter to scrubbing out a dumpster, I would have been there. Was I angry? You betcha. Was that gonna drive me to make a point? You betcha. Is that why I'm here today? Yes, it is.
It sounds ridiculous in extreme. I question its credibility. I question its veracity. I don't know who Jordan Anderson is, and I don't know when that occurred. I don't know who it was who was involved in it or why it is she would have done that.
Jordan Anderson's experience is echoed by another young woman on the other side of the world in Los Angeles. Laura DeCrescenzo is one of a small group of former Scientologists who are taking the church to court in America for alleged violations of workplace legislation. Like Jordan Anderson, Laura says she had to work excessive hours and was once asked to scrub out a dumpster.
Someone came up to me and said, okay, you need to come downstairs with me. So we went downstairs, and she handed me a toothbrush and said, you need to clean this dumpster with a toothbrush. And I said, no. I said, you got to be kidding me. No, I'm not going to do that.
Laura DeCrescenzo has backed her allegations with sworn statements, and other former Scientologists have as well. The church accuses the American litigants of lacking credibility and having ulterior motives. You're taking the church to court. Why are you doing that?
My lawsuit covers human trafficking, labor law violations, and forced abortions. And there's many reasons. I mean, obviously, I came to realize that if no one ever has the strength to stand up and say the truth of what went on, then it will only continue and get worse.
My court case in the United States is basically alleging that they should be paying minimum wage. That's pretty much it. That there's human trafficking going on, which is basically holding people to work for a wage that's less than what they should be being paid, and not allowing them to just leave if they want to leave.
One issue in the courts will be the fact that the church doesn't pay its staff in the Sea Org a minimum wage. It argues that members of the Sea Org are not employees, but volunteers who don't expect to be paid.
We do so out of our own religious conviction and our desire to work for and be part of and contribute to our religion and its activities. And as such, we don't expect a wage, and we don't do it for a wage.
However, Mark Headley says he signed a contract of employment similar to this one when he joined the Sea Org and was promised a minimum wage.
15 years later, I was paid an average of 38 cents an hour for working over 100 hours a week, every single week of every year for 15 years. In 15 years, I made a total of $29,000 for 100 hours a week, every week.
When Mark and Claire met, they were posted to one of the church's most secure Sea Org facilities at Hemet, 2 hours' drive outside Los Angeles. The facility is surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. What did the church tell you about people who wanted to leave?
That people in the Sea organization have foregone the right to leave, and that was reiterated on many different instances. I mean, honestly, I've reflected since leaving, and the only thing that even comes close for me in terms of living conditions and everything else is prison. Just is.
Claire Headley joined the Sea Org age 16 and worked for the Religious Technology Center, earning as little as $23 a week. How hard was it doing that job?
Words don't describe it. I mean, you know, there was 2 to 3 year periods where if I slept at all, it was in an office chair or on a floor or 2 hours in a bed. I very, very rarely saw Mark.
Claire Headley says excessive hours and little pay weren't the only form of abuse she and other women were subjected to. She says she was coerced by senior staff into having 2 abortions. The church denies these allegations.
I will always have that emotional scar and wounds. It's a horrifying form of abuse that goes on very prevalently in the Sea organization.
Claire Headley says the first abortion took place when she was 19 years old. She and Mark had married 2 years earlier.
I had not been paid in months, and I'd used birth control before, but I could not afford it. They sat down with me and prepared me for essentially saying, good, we're going to take you to the Planned Parenthood. They're going to ask you, do you want an abortion? You are to say yes. And I was going to be driven there by a staff member who would be waiting for me outside in the waiting room. So there was absolutely no option. I mean, I was absolutely cornered. This was my worst nightmare come true, absolutely.
Claire Headley says her second abortion took place in Clearwater, Florida. Again, she says she had no money for contraception. She asked to speak to her husband, Mark, who was still at the Hemet base outside Los Angeles.
That was not authorized. Essentially, I was forced to go through with this. I wasn't able to tell Mark anything of this until the next time I saw him physically, which was 8 months later.
That's when I found out. I was not consulted. I was not told. It was kept quiet. Nothing.
What is the Sea Org policy on having children?
Sea Org members do not have children. If someone is a member of the Sea Organization and they wish to have a child, they would need to do so outside of the Sea Org, at which point, when the child is of age, those individuals could come back, to the Sea Organization if they so chose. And that's been policy for almost 20 years now.
Why does the church ask pregnant women in Sea Org to have abortions if they wish to stay in the Sea Org?
Absolutely, that is absolutely not true, and I categorically deny that allegation. The Church of Scientology would, under no circumstances, and it certainly has no reflection in church policy, tell a woman what to do with her body, tell a woman what to do with regards to her child, her pregnancy, her family, or any such thing.
Right. Uh-oh.
This, though, is exactly what many women allege. Claire Headley says she knows of about 40 other women in the Sea Org who say they've been pressured into having abortions. Laura DeCrescenzo joined the Sea Org in Los Angeles aged 12 and says she was coerced into having an abortion 5 years later by a senior officer.
She started explaining to me that at this stage, the baby, as they refer to it, there was no thetan there, meaning there was no spirit occupying the body. She was saying, look at how detrimental it would be to the organization if you were to leave. Your post or your job is very important here. We don't have anybody else to put in that job right now. Just the continual pounding, I ended up conceding and doing the abortion.
You have 2 beautiful little boys.
I do.
Do you ever look at them and think what might have been?
Of course.
In Australia, when Liz Anderson was in the Sea Org and thought she might be pregnant, she too told a senior officer.
She said, well, you just can't be pregnant, because at that stage the new policy had come in that you can't have children in the Sea Org. I was not pregnant, it turned out, but my decision would have been to keep the child.
But what did she advise you to do?
I'd have to have an abortion.
If there was a Sea Org staffer or a number of staffers who had advised women to have abortions, that's something you would utterly condemn?
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's another disturbing aspect to life in the Sea Org. When members of the organization transgress, they risk being sent to the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force. In 1978, after all the years she'd given to Scientology, Hannah Eltringham Whitfield was consigned to the RPF by L. Ron Hubbard for performing badly in a session on Scientology's controversial counseling tool, the E-meter.
I was led there forcibly by 2 huge men and confined, locked up in a room with no windows for 2 days and 2 nights, during which time I almost went out of my mind. They do that as a sort of a chilling out period.
One of Laura de Crescenzo's first jobs in the Sea Org was to send fellow members of the Sea Org to the RPF. She was 12 years old at the time. Later, she herself was sent there.
So, Laura, how does it feel coming back here?
It makes me sick to my stomach. It's kind of nerve-wracking to come to the building. I mean, this is where I was trapped for 3 years, the last 3 years that I was in the Sea Org. I was segregated from everybody in the RPF.
So where is the RPF? Point it out to me.
Right in that area, right there, the second floor is where their berthing is.
How many people sleep in these dormitories?
It varies depending on the size of the room, but there were some that actually had up to 40 people in it.
In Australia, too, the RPF plays a significant part in the Sea Org regime. Peter O'Brien abandoned Scientology last year. In 1997, she says, she was consigned to the RPF here at Dundas, outside Sydney.
You are allowed to study for 5 hours, and then the rest of it is cleaning and heavy work, heavy labour. Remember, we're already heavily indoctrinated when we're working in a Sea Org, so when they give you a pick and a mallet and tell you to go and break rocks, you do it, and you run everywhere.
It sounds very harsh.
Very harsh.
Am I right that within the RPF, there's a further RPF?
It's called the RPF's RPF, yes.
What is that?
That is the lowest of the low, as far as not even the other RPFers are allowed to speak to you, as in the communication is cut.
Joe Reish was never sent to the RPF, but saw it in operation.
To me, it's a slave camp, there's no question about it, because people are definitely abused. They're stripped of any rights as an individual. They're not allowed to talk to public individuals. They have to run from one station to another. No walking, no slow pace, it's movement. What it really is a breakdown of the spirit.
The Rehabilitation Project Force is a program within the Church's religious order whereby Sea Org members who burn out on their jobs or are failing or incapable of or not performing well in their functions can be given the voluntary opportunity to have a period of reflection, rehabilitation, redemption, making of amends within the religion as an alternative to being expelled from the Church's religious order.
So it's a punishment, in fact?
Absolutely not. The Rehabilitation Project Force is one of the oldest religious traditions. It's almost as old as religious orders themselves.
In correspondence with Four Corners, you described it as a private religious retreat.
That's correct.
Tommy Davis says that the RPF is a private religious retreat.
A private religious retreat? He's got to be hallucinating. Ask him what drugs he's taking.
Oh, you got hiccups, huh?
After Mark Headley was threatened with being sent to the RPF, he fled Hemet on a motorbike. His wife Claire followed soon after.
Kaylee, look at Mommy.
But many of those, like the Headleys who've left the Sea Org, report being pursued and spied on afterwards.
I'm driving down Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, and I noticed a Ford F-150 that was following alongside me.
When we filmed with Mark Headley in Los Angeles late one night, we were tailed by a car.
I left in 2005, and I've had a good 4 years of experience in being followed by private investigators sent by Scientology. So it's a bit odd. I mean, I'm driving my kids to school, and I have a private investigator following me. It's I've had private investigators show up at my place of business. I've had private investigators camped outside my house day and night. My garbage has been dug through.
Half an hour later, back at our West Hollywood hotel, there was a familiar vehicle parked outside.
We're going to see if it is the same vehicle and the same license plate. And I will tell you that, yes, it is. 8U2-9097. There's a gentleman who is sitting down now.
Let's go. Come on, guys.
Laying down.
Hi!
That was a private investigator who's been following us all night long.
Is it possible that a church attorney hired a private detective to follow Four Corners and Mark Headley while we were filming? Is that possible?
I couldn't comment on that. I couldn't comment. I mean, I couldn't be able to. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I have no knowledge on it, so I don't know how to answer it.
This week, Australia's Senate is expected to vote on whether to launch an inquiry into the alleged abuses against Australians that have taken place within Scientology's organisation. Around the world, the Church faces challenges in the courts, in parliaments, and from charitable authorities unconvinced that it was established for the public benefit. Liz and James Anderson, along with other ex-Scientologists, are considering pursuing a class action aimed at getting their money back. Their own claim totals around $650,000. Last year, Liz and James Anderson finally lost patience with the Church. Fiona had gone for good, and they were determined that Jordan should not disappear as well. They learned that Jordan, who was unhappy in the Sea Org and wanted to leave, was to be sent out of the country to Florida the very next day. How did you react?
I said, there's no fucking way that's going to happen. How the fuck does that work? And I was pissed off. And I wasn't going to pull any punches on it. I said, there's no way that this is going to happen.
After giving a deadline to the Church to allow their daughter to leave, Liz Anderson drove to Sydney and sat outside in her car for 4 days, waiting for Jordan to emerge. Jordan says she was interrogated throughout that period, undergoing repeated security checks.
They would interrogate me for over 12 hours in session, self-checking me, trying to find my indiscretions against the Church.
Finally, she was shown the door, emerging into her mother's arms at 10 minutes to midnight. It's a moment Liz Anderson will never forget.
I just couldn't believe it, that I had the girl. And it was a moment of, oh my God, we're free.